Hi, and welcome to the DecisionWise Engaging People podcast. My name is Charles Rogel. I'm a senior consultant here with DecisionWise. Today I'm joined by Dan Hoops, a principal consultant here at DecisionWise as well.
Good afternoon.
So today we're going to touch on one of the ongoing list of topics that we're going to address, basically tips for managers on how to better engage and manage your team. Today's topic is on creating a safe environment for your employees to share ideas and opinions. Specifically, we asked a couple of questions on our employee surveys to measure this, and one of those is this idea that I feel comfortable speaking up when I disagree with a decision. So, Dan, I'm going to first ask you to maybe frame what you see as this issue and how it plays out in organizations and what typically employees experience when this isn't working and maybe the environment managers sometimes create that cause this to not function as well.
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. You know, you probably like me have been in organizations where I'm sitting in a meeting and wondering, hey, should I raise my hand? Is it okay to give a contrary voice or opinion around my thoughts? How is it going to be received, and what is the reaction ultimately from my leader, and is it a career-ending move?
Yeah.
I remember I experienced that in one organization where I was working, and I took a position very contrary to the other 20 people in the room, and I had to defend my position, and what I learned was they weren't curious about my position. They were more interested in defending theirs. And as I sat down, I could hear a person in the room say, "Can you believe that that's what our HR manager believes?" and I learned at that point, hey, if you didn't want me to speak up and give my opinion, or if you really didn't value my opinion, even though it may be different than yours, then don't ask for it. Mm-hmm. So I think part of the problem that occurs is when leaders should be answering the question, why should leaders want opinions from others? Uh-huh. And for me, I think it moves them from a position of a single point of failure. So it may be true, most likely not, that I'm the smartest person in the room. That puts a lot of pressure on me to be the most thoughtful, precise decision maker out of the entire room.
Yeah, you got to be right all the time.
If I want to diffuse that accountability to a higher percentage of people, if you think of just the ratio, 1-on-1, which is me against myself, mm-hmm. or 1-5, I'll take the 1-5 every day, where I can have 5 thought partners instead of 1 thought partner, and it helps me mitigate that single point of failure.
Yeah.
The challenge that I think we run into as leaders is really making sure that we come from a position of curiosity, not a position of defending our opinion. So when I think of the problem, or the problem that we're trying to solve, is making sure that leaders lead with a mindset of being open, being curious, wanting to make sure that they're getting the ideas that are spread through a lot of smart people inside of the organization, and that they're using the minds and the talents of those that have really great experience ultimately to solve the problem instead of just one person trying to do it.
So in essence, you're trying to be more collaborative. You're trying to build ownership and buy-in to the decision as well by involving other people in it.
Yeah, and part of that is being really clear on what my role is in the decision-making process. Mm-hmm. So I may own the decision. And I'm going to work with other people that are going to give me their ideas and their inputs. Mm-hmm. And I call them contributors. There's ultimately someone that needs to approve the decision, and then there are those that just need to be informed because they don't have a vote, if you will.
Sure.
Part of the challenge comes when those that should be informed about a decision think that they have more vote or power or voice than what they actually have. So I think part of the first process is being really clear on the decision-making process, mm-hmm. who owns the decision, who are the contributors, who are those that should be informed, and why they should play that role. Yeah. The confusion card, it's when they creep from one level to another position. If I think that I own that position or own that decision or own, it's my right within my role as a leader, and someone says, no, that's outside of your responsibility, that's where the conflict occurs. So I've worked in organizations where really thoughtful leaders have put in management practices to really offset that. So one organization where I worked at, the senior leader would walk into the room, and if they were to debate a really difficult issue for the company, he would divide the room in half along their meeting room table. And one side of the table would be for the position, and another side would be against the decision that they were going to make. And they would have a really spirited debate around why they should make that decision, both from the pros and the cons standpoint. Well, then halfway through the argument, he would make them switch roles. And they would have to come to an agreement on what the decision was. What we learned through the process was it didn't matter whether I agreed or whether I disagreed. If my voice was heard and I knew that it was being acknowledged in the entire process, I had a much easier time committing to whatever that decision was. I've discovered that the conflict of, this uncomfortable of speaking up is when the decision is so far down the road that they're not really interested in my opinion.
Yeah.
What they're trying to do is just inform me of what the decision was and make me feel good about it.
Right. So don't try to tell me there's a room for debate right now when there's not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we've all run into that experience, and the manager then goes into the position of defending the decision instead of informing why the decision was made and connecting back to the strategy, which is the next point was when a decision is made or we disagree with a decision, I think there's always a failure point, which is missing the connection back to the strategy and how it helps connect and deliver against the organizational strategy, the why, if you will, of why that decision was made. So at least for me, I found myself disagreeing more with decisions when I don't understand the why behind it or what problem it was solving and why did you make that decision versus something else. And the third part of that was, well, why didn't you come and ask me? If you knew that I had an expertise in that, why wouldn't you do that? That happened to me one time in my career where I knew people were going to go meet with some senior leaders inside of the business, and I had been in that business, and I knew the business really, really well, and they had this meeting. And I'm like, why didn't you just talk to me before you went there? I could give you a lot more context about how to make that a more successful interaction. So when you feel comfortable speaking up, I think you can share those thoughts and opinions with someone that's open to them, and they don't necessarily get attacked. Or I'm getting attacked in return. But I think it's important to have that collaboration, as you'd say, back and forth, and making sure that people come from a position of genuine curiosity to understand what I'm thinking or what information I may have.
So essentially, it's important for a manager to be able to frame the decision, whether, hey, this is open for discussion now and I want to get the best information on the table, or, hey, this decision's been made, but I want to hear your voices and hear your concerns and see if we can address it and still move forward.
Yeah, it's really just making sure that it's framed up of, here was the decision that we needed to, or here's the problem that we were trying to solve.
Yeah.
Here's the process that we went through with that decision so that they understand the logic behind of it. And then in letting them know where they stand in that decision-making process. I remember working for inside of an organization, and we were having a leadership meeting with all of the vice presidents and directors of this company. And when I was in leadership development, we were helping to facilitate this process. And the CEO was teaching the senior leaders this decision-making process and how to speak up and how to disagree. And it's not about agree or disagree. It's about more of commitment and ownership of who makes the decision. And the CEO of this company had the senior vice president of this large business unit stand up. And he asked him one key question. Let's just use his name, Dan, because he may be similar to me. Dan, who owns the decision of the price increase for this product? And a lot of people would say, well, they may be thinking, well, obviously the CEO does because it impacts revenue for the company, or the CFO may because it would impact earnings, or there are a lot of people that would have argument of who would own the decision on price increase.
Yeah.
And Dan said, I do. Just completely confident. And the room was kind of quiet while they waited for the response from the CEO. And he says, you're right, because you're the leader of the business. So when we become clear on, and it's framed up properly of what the decision is and why we're trying to get there, my ability to speak up when I agree or disagree, as I'm invited into that process, I don't know why people feel fear when they do that, because the environment is created in a way where they can speak up, because there's the dialogue going back and forth, and people genuinely know where they stand.
Another problem I see is that sometimes it's unclear to to your example, it's unclear to employees who owns the decision, whether it's their boss's boss, someone else in a different department. And so they're left somewhat confused and misguided in terms of where to go for information, who's going to make a call on this so I can get my work done, that sort of thing. So how do you make more clarity around that?
The most successful organizations that I've worked in are very clear on the decision-making process at the beginning of the decision-making process.
Right.
So rather than getting a group of 5 or 10 people together and saying, hey, here's the decision that we make, or ultimately, here's the decision that we need to make.
Yeah.
The first part of the meeting was who owns what, and what is everybody's role in this decision. So, for example, I'll go back to another company where they were making a decision on the engineering of a product on one of the software solutions that we had, and I think he was the vice president of product development was walking into the meeting, and actually it was the CEO again, was walking down the hall and said, "Oh, where are you going? He says, "Oh, I've got this group together because we're going to decide if we're going to do this on the technology or if we're going to do that on the technology platform." And he says, "Well, what's the probability of decision A?" He said, "Oh, probably about 80%. Okay, I just made the decision. There's your solution. Now go figure out how to make it work." So part of I think the churn that we get into in speaking up or disagreeing with a decision is we want to make everybody feel good.
Yeah.
And so we get groups together to give their voice and give their input, when in reality we should be defining the roles and the responsibilities of those contributors into the decision so that they know why they're invited into the decision-making process. They know their role, they know their responsibility, they know their accountability, and they know that they can speak up freely because that's what they've been told to do.
Yeah.
The really wise leader simply facilitates that process and makes sure that the opinions are really heard and understood and reconciled, and then they tell them why they made the decision.
So instead of making it a collaborative approach every single time and trying to get consensus around making a decision, you're saying sometimes decisions need to be made, but it's working out the details where people can have more of a voice and ownership.
Yes, and part of that is the most successful leaders that I've worked with give credit openly to those that had the idea that ultimately was implemented. And then it validates, hey, I can go into a meeting and I can give my opinion. I can agree, I can disagree, I can give my input, I can give my logic, I can give my reasoning, and I don't have to be afraid of somebody taking my idea or not giving credit where credit was due. And it helps me feel validated that what I'm doing is contributing ultimately to the outcome.
Sure.
It's been really effective to make sure that the credit is given, and then it would offset what you were just describing.
So another common concern I think managers have is that they worry that by opening up the floor, it turns into a gripe session, and we just get a bunch of negativity in the room, and we're not really kind of solution-oriented or problem-solving. What's a good way to mitigate that, or at least turn, negative responses into a positive conversation?
I think it's by actually acknowledging and appreciating the negative responses. I don't believe people wake up in the morning and say to themselves, how can I go to work today and not perform at my peak?
Right.
I think what happens is the organization, as the saying goes, is perfectly organized to be getting the outcomes that they're getting. Mm-hmm. So if I'm facilitating a meeting and my team is extremely frustrated, there's something that's causing that frustration. So if I'm not mindful enough to listen to them, to understand what their position is, especially if they're the front line, because they're the ones that are closest to the customers, then that's a management issue. I don't think that's an employee issue. The employees need to be brought there to help solve problems. And I think the majority of employees do, because ultimately they want to create a better outcome for the customer and a better outcome in the work experience. So I am actually not afraid of walking into a meeting as a leader or even as a facilitator for organizations where someone said, oh, beware, this may be a really cranky group. It's like, okay, well, why are they cranky? Let's get to the root cause of what's contributing to that, because ultimately my experience would tell me that they're usually leading through an issue that says, if you were to fix this, then it would make it better.
Yeah.
So simply listening to them, making sure that they're understood and summarizing, I think, is really critical to diffuse the energy of kind of those negative ones. And then it's okay, let me summarize what I've heard. Now, if we were to implement a change, what would that look like? And move them from the decision of, well, this was kind of messed up in the history, to what would it look like in the future. Brainstorming and an idea generation around future ideas is much, much more energizing than simply discussing all the things that are wrong.
Yeah.
But you have to honor, if you will, the current situation so that you can make sure that you can move to the future.
So then advice for organizations. So at the organization level, they score low on this particular question. I feel comfortable speaking up when I disagree about a decision, or I feel comfortable speaking up without fear of retribution. What can an organization do to encourage their employees to speak up and be heard?
I think it's creating a culture of, the term that I would use is wonderful arguments.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in leadership development, I created a workshop that we called constructive debate. And we implemented it in a very large division of the organization. And we discovered that it was a skill, not necessarily something that they didn't do. So when individuals learn the skill of constructive debate, they can ask questions in a way that doesn't feel like I'm being attacked.
Yeah.
Or they can defend their position while giving information that allows others to inquire to them how they came to that conclusion. So if you create this environment where fear is mitigated and you have wonderful arguments and discussions, then I'm a firm believer that ultimately you can get a much better outcome, because the best ideas always win.
Yeah.
And it's not about hierarchy. It's let's win. And if people can frame it around, especially managers can frame the challenge and the decision that ultimately would make us win, then I think we get much better outcomes.
Excellent. So Dan, anything else you'd add around making it safe for ideas and opinions in the workplace?
The last thing that I would say is I would just iterate what I said at the beginning is the best way to mitigate failure on a decision is help to diffuse that accountability, if you will, in the thought process by making sure that you're getting really good input from those that have the best ideas. Mm-hmm. And that happens more than simply me sitting in my office thinking on my own, because I don't know what I'm missing. The second part would be really come from a position of curiosity, not defense of the decision that I've made, especially if I'm in the process of making that decision, so that I am facilitating a process or an engagement around the quality of the discussion.
Good points, yeah. And I think one thing I'll add is that it's important because, especially if you're in an environment where this is scoring low, a lot of times employees have seen in the past that people that speak up either got in trouble. Some people say someone got fired for speaking up, and all of a sudden people are afraid to really voice their opinion. But the more you're able to kind of hang in there and wade through kind of the mess, or at least hear people out, then it starts turning productive. It doesn't stay in that negative space all the time. Yeah,
and I was working with a leader that took over this area of the business that was really the opposite of what you just described.
Yeah.
They were afraid to speak up, and one of the things that he did to introduce that he genuinely wanted to hear their opinions is at the end of each meeting, he would ask plus delta, what worked and what didn't work. And the first time speaking with Peter, he says, the first time that I conducted that meeting, there was nobody that gave their thoughts on, well, what didn't work. Cause it's like, well, I'm not going to tell the senior VP what didn't work in this meeting. I just met him.
Yeah.
And time after time after time, he would do a plus delta, what worked, what didn't work at the end of our meeting. And it created the environment where people say, oh, he really does want to hear me.
Yeah.
So part of that accountability is for the leaders to create that environment and using methodologies to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's going to take a few times.
It does.
Happen overnight.
Yep. You have to have a sustained experience, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Make it work. Excellent. Well, Dan, thank you very much for all the insight. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on our podcast today, and we look forward to having you join us on a future podcast.
Great. I hope some of the ideas were helpful.